December 1943. A conference room at Pearl Harbor. Three of the finest military minds America had ever produced sat across the table from one man, and all three told him the same thing. Too dangerous. Reckless. Wait. 3 weeks earlier, that man had walked the length of a beach called Bedio, where the sand was still black from the weight of naval gunfire, and the shovels had not yet finished their work. He had read hundreds of letters from mothers who wanted to know why their sons were never coming home. He had written back to every single one. Now his best commanders were begging him not to make the same mistake twice. Skip the outer islands, they said. Build your way in slowly. Do not go straight for the center. He listened to every argument. Then he said something that would either save thousands of lives or bury his career and a generation of young men beside it. If you have never heard the name Kwajalein, that is not an accident. History remembers the battles that cost the most. This one succeeded so completely, it was almost erased. This is the story of the decision no one talks about. The airstrip on Bedio had taken fire for 4 straight days. The engineers were still patching the coral when the plane came in low over the lagoon on the morning of November 27, 1943, and touched down anyway. Admiral Nimitz stepped out onto ground that no longer looked like ground. Before the battle, Bedio had been a narrow strip of packed coral, not even a quarter-mile wide and barely 2 miles long, crowded with concrete bunkers, coconut palms, and close to 5,000 Japanese troops who had spent 2 years turning it into what their own commander called an island that 1,000,000 men could not take in 100 years. After the battle, there was nothing left standing above a man's chest. Every palm tree was gone. Every bunker was cracked open or burned black. The sand itself had been churned into something that was no longer sand, packed down and darkened in places by the sheer weight of the shelling. And underneath all of it, the dead. Nimitz walked the length of the island anyway. 30 years in the United States Navy had shown him the aftermath of battle more times than he could count. The wreckage, the wounded, the silence that follows. Nothing had prepared him for Bedio. The men assigned to bury the dead had been working since the fighting stopped, and there were not enough of them, and the island was so small that there was nowhere left to walk that was far from the work still waiting to be done. The heat pressed down on everything, thick and wet, the kind of heat that made a wool uniform feel like a second skin. Flies rose in clouds from places no one wanted to look at directly. The lagoon water lapped at the shattered pier pilings, flat and blue and indifferent to what had happened on the sand beside it. The smell had no name that belonged in a report or a letter home, and it clung to a man's uniform long after he had climbed back into the plane and lifted off the shattered runway. He did not write much about what he saw that day. Some things resist language, but he understood something standing on that beach that no map, no photograph, and no briefing back in Washington could fully carry across the ocean. The men who died on Bedio had not died because they lacked courage. They had climbed out of their landing craft under machine gun fire and kept walking through water up to their chests, and not one of them turned back. They died because of a mistake made long before they ever boarded a boat. The invasion plan had called for 5 feet of water over the surrounding reef at the hour of the landing, enough for the flat-bottomed Higgins boats to clear the coral and reach the beach without trouble. But November 20th fell on one of only 2 days each year when a neap tide holds the water down instead of letting it rise. The reef sat barely 3 feet below the surface that morning, maybe less. The landing craft ground to a halt 800 yards from shore, and the Marines climbed over the sides into water that came up past their belts, then their chests, and they walked the rest of the way in, under fire that never let up. Of the 125 amphibious tractors built to cross that same reef without trouble, most were burning or sinking before the first day ended. The naval bombardment meant to soften the island had lasted only 3 hours, and it had used shells that exploded on contact, devastating against open trenches and exposed men, but next to useless against bunkers built from coconut logs and reinforced concrete designed for exactly this kind of punishment. It was not a failure of courage, it was a failure of planning, and every man who died in that water had understood the difference, even if there had been no time to say so out loud. Nimitz came home from Betio and sat down at his desk, and the letters were already waiting for him. His aide, Commander Hal Lamar, had tried more than once to set them aside. Lamar understood better than almost anyone what the Admiral was already carrying. The entire war in the Pacific balanced on his decisions. One island and one convoy and one carrier task force at a time, and he saw no reason to add hundreds of grieving letters to that weight. Nimitz disagreed. He read every one. They arrived from small towns across the country, from farms outside Athens, Georgia, from row houses in Pittsburgh, from a ranch outside Amarillo, Texas, places where boys had grown up playing baseball in the street and had shipped out to the Pacific and had not come home. Some of the envelopes were creased from handling, addresses written in the careful, uneven hand of someone who did not write many letters and had not expected to write this one. The letters did not soften anything for him. "You killed my son on Tarawa. My boy is dead because of you. What was any of it for?" Nimitz read every line, and then he sat down and answered every one of them himself, in his own hand. No form letter, no aide standing in for him, no template pulled from a drawer. Lamar would find him at the desk late into the evening, the lamp burning, a stack of finished replies growing slowly beside a stack that never seemed to grow any smaller. He wrote to his wife that he was as distressed as he had ever been in his life. He used the word prayed, actually wrote it down. Prayed for the killing to stop. Prayed for the war to end, before it asked for another beach like Betio. He walked the hospital wards at Pearl Harbor in the weeks that followed, moving from bed to bed among men who had lost arms, lost legs, lost pieces of themselves that could not be written into any letter home without breaking whoever read it. The wards smelled of antiseptic and clean linen, a world away from the smell that still followed him from Betio, and somehow that made it worse, not better. He sat beside a 19-year-old soldier who was dying, and he told him his country was proud of him, and the boy died with something like a smile on his face. Nimitz walked back out into the corridor, past the rows of beds and the quiet murmur of men trying not to let each other hear them in pain, and the next morning he returned to his desk and kept working. Here is the part that does not show up clearly in most history books. Nimitz never doubted that taking Tarawa had been necessary. The airfield, the base, the position, all of it fed directly into the next step, and the next, a chain that ran from the Gilbert Islands to the Marshalls, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, and from the Marianas to airfields close enough to put a B-29 over Tokyo. Every link in that chain mattered. What haunted him was never whether to fight. It was how. How do you keep moving forward across an ocean full of fortified islands and lose fewer men doing it? How do you take the next beach and bring more of your boys home than you did on the last one? That question followed him from the hospital wards back to his desk, and it did not leave him alone in the weeks that came after. Because while the burial details were still working on Betio, while the letters were still arriving in stacks, reconnaissance planes had already begun flying sorties over a different chain of islands 400 miles to the northwest, a place called the Marshalls. High-altitude passes and low-altitude passes, atoll after atoll photographed and photographed again, the film developed in cramped rooms that smelled of chemicals and cigarette smoke, then pinned up on the walls of Nimitz's headquarters at Pearl Harbor, until the outline of an entire Japanese defensive network began to take shape in front of him, one grainy photograph at a time. What the photographs showed was not what anyone expected. The outer islands of the Marshalls, places with names like Woche and Maloelap and Jalowit, were fortified exactly the way military logic said they should be. Airfields ringed with coastal guns, deep trenches, thousands of Japanese troops dug in and waiting. But Kwajalein, the atoll at the very center of the chain, the place the Japanese had used as their administrative headquarters in the Marshalls since before the war even began, looked different on those photographs. Not undefended, not an easy target by any measure, but lighter than everything around it, weaker than an atoll of its importance had any right to be. Nimitz sat with those photographs for days, turning the question over the same way he turned over every letter on his desk, looking for what it would cost and what it might save. Two of his own senior planners studied the same images and came back with careful, guarded language. Feasible, they said. Not safe. Not certain. Feasible. That word was enough to bring him to a decision he had not yet spoken out loud to anyone, a decision that would put him directly against the advice of the three men whose judgment he trusted more than almost anyone else in the Pacific, three men who had earned that trust in places far from any conference room. He picked up the telephone and asked his aide to set a meeting for the 14th of December, and he did not yet know how that room was going to answer him, only that after Bedio, after the letters, after the boy in the hospital bed who died with a smile because a grown man had knelt beside him and told him the country was proud, he was not going to walk into that meeting looking for permission to be cautious. He was looking for a way to bring more of them home. The conference room at Pearl Harbor was not built for comfort. A long table, hard chairs, charts pinned to the walls where the morning light caught the edges of the paper and made them curl slightly at the corners. A ceiling fan turned overhead, slow and useless against the heat, stirring the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke without doing much to clear it. Admiral Chester Nimitz sat at the head of it on the morning of December 14, 1943, with a folder of reconnaissance photographs closed in front of him, and three men arranged around the table who between them represented as much combined experience in Pacific warfare as any room in the country could hold. To his right sat Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, quiet, precise, the kind of officer who thought 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room and rarely raised his voice to prove it. He had commanded the carrier force at Midway when the entire war had turned on a handful of minutes, and he had come out of that battle with a reputation for a mind that did not panic and did not gamble carelessly either. Across from Nimitz sat Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the Navy's chief architect of amphibious warfare, a man built out of equal parts brilliance and stubbornness, the officer who had planned and executed the landings at Guadalcanal and Tarawa both, and who had earned the right to speak bluntly about what worked and what did not. Beside Turner sat Marine Corps General Holland Smith, a man whose nickname, Howlin' Mad, had been earned honestly over 3 decades of service, a Marine who had spent his career arguing that amphibious assault was its own kind of warfare and deserved to be studied and respected as one. 3 of the finest military minds the United States had produced, and every one of them had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of meeting. Nimitz opened the folder. He laid the photographs out one at a time, the same images he had been sitting with for days, the outer islands of the Marshalls bristling with fortifications, and at the center of the chain, Kwajalein, lighter than anything around it. He explained what his planners had found. He explained the word they had used, feasible. Then he looked at each man in turn and asked the only question that mattered. "Gentlemen, what do you think?" Spruance answered first, and he did not waste words. "Too dangerous," he said. Kwajalein sat deep inside Japanese-controlled waters, ringed on every side by islands still bristling with enemy airfields. If the landing stalled, if reinforcements moved faster than expected, there was no fallback position, nothing behind them but open ocean. Turner went further, and Turner rarely held back once he had made up his mind. "Reckless," he said, "outright reckless. You do not skip past the outer defenses of an entire island chain and drive straight for the middle. That was not how amphibious warfare worked, not how the Navy had built its doctrine, not how any of them had trained for the better part of 2 years." Holland Smith, who had argued before Tarawa that the whole Gilbert Islands campaign had been poorly conceived, found himself agreeing with Turner for once. "Take the outer islands first," he said. "Woche, Malawi Lap. Build the air cover. Reduce the risk one atoll at a time. Do not go straight at Kwajalein. Not yet." 3 men, 3 answers, all the same answer, delivered with the full weight of experience behind it, delivered by men who were not being cautious out of fear for their own careers, but out of a genuine, hard-earned conviction that the plan in front of them asked for more than the odds could reasonably promise. Here is the thing you have to understand about the man sitting at the head of that table. 3 weeks earlier, he had stood on a beach that still smelled of the dead. He had read hundreds of letters from mothers and fathers who wanted to know why their sons were never coming home, and he had written back to every one of them in his own hand. He had sat beside a dying 19-year-old and told him his country was proud of him. He was not the same man who had planned Tarawa. Something in him had shifted, quietly, in the weeks since Bedio, and it was sitting in that room with him now, even if none of the other 3 men at the table could see it. Nimitz listened to every objection without interrupting. He let Spruance finish. He let Turner finish. He let Holland Smith finish. He had, in fact, been sitting with these same objections in his own head for nearly 2 weeks already, running them against the photographs, running them against everything known about the Japanese positions in the Marshalls, running them against every version of the plan his staff had drawn up and revised and drawn up again. The reconnaissance told a story that none of the 3 men across the table had fully absorbed yet. The Japanese commander responsible for the defense of the Marshalls had studied the pattern of American operations across the Pacific and drawn a reasonable, careful, entirely logical conclusion. The United States moved cautiously. It advanced island by island, securing air bases before pushing further, reducing risk at every step. A methodical enemy would attack the outer ring first, so the Japanese had done exactly what any competent commander would do in response. They had concentrated their strongest garrisons and their heaviest fortifications on the outer islands, on Woche and Malawelap and Jaluit, and left Kwajalein itself, the administrative heart of the entire chain, comparatively lighter, because no one on the Japanese side believed the Americans would attack the center first. Which meant, if the photographs were read correctly, that the supposedly reckless option was in some ways the safer one. Hit where the enemy did not expect an attack, and the strongest Japanese position in the Marshalls would be caught at its weakest moment. It was the kind of intelligence that changes everything, or changes nothing, depending entirely on who is looking at it and what they are willing to risk on their own reading of it. A cautious man could look at the same photographs Nimitz was holding and see only the danger of pushing deep into contested waters with an exposed flank on every side. A reckless man could look at them and see only the opportunity, without weighing what it would cost if the reconnaissance was wrong, if the Japanese had reinforced the atoll in the weeks since the photographs were taken, if the whole elegant piece of reasoning collapsed the moment real shells started falling on real men. Nimitz was neither of those men, and that was precisely what made the decision in front of him so difficult to carry alone. The room went quiet after Holland Smith finished speaking. No one had said anything Nimitz had not already turned over in his own mind a dozen times. He looked around the table once more, at Spruance, calm and certain in his caution, at Turner, immovable in his conviction, at Holland Smith, still carrying the bruises of an argument he had lost once before over Tarawa and did not want to lose again in a worse way. Then Nimitz said it quietly, without raising his voice, the way he said almost everything. "Well, gentlemen, our next target will be Kwajalein." Most of the men in the room gathered their papers without another word and filed out. Spruance and Turner stayed behind. Whatever formality had governed the meeting itself dissolved the moment the door closed. They pressed him directly. The same 2 words Turner had used across the table now aimed straight at him. Dangerous. Reckless. Nimitz let them finish. He was not a man who ended arguments by pulling rank, and in 30 years of naval service, almost everyone who had worked closely with him described him the same way. Calm, approachable, genuinely willing to be told he was wrong. Spruance himself, who knew him as well as any officer in the Pacific, would later say that what he admired most about Nimitz was his intelligence, and just behind it, something he called an utter fearlessness. But there is a difference between being willing to hear that you might be wrong and being willing to let someone else's fear make the decision for you. Nimitz had built his entire career on listening, on drawing the best thinking out of the men around him before he ever committed to a course of action. And nothing about that habit had changed in this room. He had listened. He had weighed every word Spruance and Turner had just given him one more time. And he had still arrived, on his own, at the same answer he had carried into the meeting. "If you do not want to do it," Nimitz told them, "I will find someone who will." That was the end of the conversation. Spruance and Turner walked out of the conference room, and the decision stood. What none of the three men in that room could have known, what no one on the American side could have known with certainty, was that the Japanese commander and the marshals had done exactly what Spruance and Turner assumed the Americans would do in return, which was to prepare for the attack he expected, instead of the attack that was actually coming. There is something about that decision that rarely makes it into the official histories in plain language. The histories will tell you the intelligence was solid. The photographs supported the plan. The logic held together. All of that is true. What gets left out is simpler and harder to sit with. Nimitz did not know, not with certainty, not in the way a man knows the answer to an equation. He had evidence. He had analysis from officers he trusted. He had 30 years of instinct about how navies fight and how men break under pressure. But between the evidence in front of him and the certainty he wanted, there was a gap, and there always is. Nimitz understood the gap was there. He crossed it anyway, because the alternative on offer, the slow and careful and thoroughly reasonable alternative his three best commanders were urging him toward, meant more weeks of bombing outer islands while Japanese engineers poured more concrete at Kwajalein, more weeks of transport ships crossing an ocean toward a target that grew harder to take with every day those weeks lasted. He had read those letters on his desk. He was not going to manufacture more of them for the sake of caution that felt safe only because it was familiar. On the voyage home from Tarawa, Rear Admiral Turner had sat down somewhere in the middle of the Pacific and started writing. He titled the document Recommendations for Changes and Improvements in Tactics, Techniques, Existing Instructions and Material, and it ran long, page after page of hard, specific observation about everything that had gone wrong at Bedio. Back at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz's own planning officer, Captain James Steele, had assembled a companion document with a title that needed no elaboration. 100 Mistakes Made on Tarawa. 100. That second document became something close to an operating manual for everything that followed. Every man who had died on that reef had, in a sense, written a line into it without knowing it. The tide calculation, written down. The 3-hour bombardment that had not been enough, written down. The shortage of amphibious tractors that could actually cross the reef, written down. The communication failures between the ships offshore and the men fighting on the beach, written down. The failure to scout the reef conditions in the final hours before the landing, written down. Officers who had stood on that beach alongside Nimitz, who had watched the same burial details working through the same unbearable heat, sat down with Steele and Turner's staff and went through the fighting hour by hour, admitting to mistakes that no one wanted to put their name next to, but that everyone understood had to be written down anyway, because the alternative was watching the same mistakes repeat themselves on the next beach and the one after that. Everything that had put Marines into chest-deep water 800 yards from a beach lined with machine guns was now on paper, with a proposed fix sitting beside it. By the time the fleet assembled for Kwajalein, 5 specific changes stood between this operation and the one that had come before it. The first change was the bombardment itself. At Bedio, the ships had fired for 3 hours, from a distance considered safe enough to protect the vessels doing the shelling, using high-explosive rounds that detonated on contact with the surface. Against open trenches and exposed men, those shells had been devastating. Against reinforced concrete bunkers built to absorb exactly that kind of punishment, they had done almost nothing. For Kwajalein, the bombardment would run for 3 full days, not 3 hours, and it would use armor-piercing rounds built to punch through concrete before detonating inside the structure meant to protect the men sheltering there. The second change was the direction of the assault. At Bedio, the landing had come from the ocean side, the obvious approach, the side the Japanese had spent 2 years fortifying because it was the side any textbook would tell you to expect an invasion from. At Kwajalein, the landings would come from the lagoon side instead, where the water ran deeper close to shore and the coral thinner, and where Japanese planners had assumed, wrongly, that American landing craft could never cross the outer reef to attack from behind. After Tarawa, they knew better. But knowing better 6 weeks before an invasion does not move concrete gun emplacements that took 2 years to build. The heaviest Japanese guns still faced the open ocean on the morning of the invasion, aimed at a threat that was never going to come from that direction. The third change was the seizure of the small islands surrounding the main targets before the main assault ever began. Tiny slivers of coral, some barely wide enough for a man to stand on, would be taken first, in the dark, by soldiers and Marines who slipped ashore in rubber boats, while the main islands slept under a sky still lit by naval gunfire. Army howitzers and Marine artillery would be dragged onto those islets within hours, registered and ready to fire on the main islands before the primary landings even started. Every major objective would be hit from land and sea at the same moment, instead of relying on naval gunfire alone, and by the night before the main assault, gun crews working by flashlight would have their weapons zeroed in on targets they could not yet see but had already measured to the yard. The fourth change was the creation of the underwater demolition teams, men who would swim in ahead of the landing craft, sometimes in daylight, sometimes under fire, wearing little more than swim trunks and a knife, to map the reef, mark safe channels, and clear obstacles before anyone else arrived. It was cold, exposed, nearly suicidal work by any reasonable measure, and the men who volunteered for it did so knowing that if the tide turned against them the way it had at Betio, they would be the first to know it and the first to pay for it. No one else would discover a hidden problem in the dark by running into it, the way an entire generation of Marines had at Betio. The fifth change was the landing craft themselves. The amphibious tractors had been reinforced, better armored, better armed, and built in far greater numbers, enough to carry the first waves across any reef, regardless of what the tide happened to be doing on the morning of the invasion. No plan would ever again depend on the ocean cooperating on schedule. 5 changes. None of them the product of genius alone. All of them paid for, in the plainest sense, with the lives of the men who had died at Tarawa, men whose names most of the officers writing these reports had never known and never would. But there was one commander at Kwajalein who took all 5 of those lessons and added something of his own to them. Rear Admiral Richard Lansing Connolly commanded the Northern Attack Force, the ships and Marines assigned to take the twin islands of Roy and Namur at the top of the atoll. Connolly was not a famous man. He did not chase headlines. He carried something closer to an engineer's mind inside an admiral's uniform, and he held one belief that he had been building toward for most of his career. A shell fired from a safe distance arrives at an angle, and some percentage of the time it does real damage, and the rest of the time the men inside a bunker walk away from it unhurt. A shell fired from close range arrives nearly flat against the face of a fortification, with enough force behind it to drive straight through the wall instead of merely rattling it. If you want to destroy a hardened position, not just inconvenience it, you have to get close enough to risk something in exchange. On the afternoon of February 1st, 1944, with the bombardment already in its 3rd day, and the northern islands of the atoll wrapped in smoke that had not cleared since dawn, Connolly decided to prove it. At 12 minutes past noon, he sent a signal to the battleship USS Maryland. The message read that he desired Maryland to move in really close that afternoon for counter-battery and counter-blockhouse fire, using pointer fire for both the main and secondary batteries. Move in really close. In a Navy built on precise, standardized language, that phrase stood out like a man speaking plainly in a room full of formal reports. Maryland moved. So did the battleship Mississippi, which pulled to within 1,500 yards of the Japanese shoreline, close enough that sailors on deck could watch through their gun sights as individual coconut palms disintegrated under the impact of 14-inch shells fired at nearly point-blank range. At that distance, a gunnery officer no longer needed a spotter plane or a chart to correct his aim. He needed only his own eyes, and what his own eyes told him was that the shells were landing exactly where he wanted them, tearing into targets that had shrugged off 2 days of conventional bombardment fired from a safer, more comfortable range. The Japanese gunners on shore could see the ships just as clearly as the ships could see them, and for a few hours on that stretch of coastline, the war became as close and as personal as naval gunfire ever gets. Two sides watching each other across water shallow enough to walk. From that afternoon forward, Richard Connolly carried a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his career and the rest of his life. Close in Connolly. He had put his own ships within range of enemy guns to save the men who would be walking onto that beach behind him. And there is nothing complicated about that trade in the abstract. Almost every commander understands it in principle. What takes something more than understanding is the willingness to actually give the order, to send your own hull into danger because you believe, all the way down, that the men who will be waiting ashore afterward are worth the risk you are asking your own crew to carry. It is one thing to approve that trade on paper in a planning session. It is another thing entirely to stand on the bridge of a battleship and watch the range close, knowing every yard gained for the men on the beach is a yard of protection given up by the ship under your own feet. Connolly believed it. On the first day of February 1944, he proved it, and the men who came ashore at Roy and Namur a few hours later walked onto a beach that had already been broken open by admirals who had learned, at a terrible cost, exactly what it took to make sure fewer of them would have to pay for it themselves. The landings began before dawn on January 31, 1944. Rubber boats slid off the sides of transport ships in the dark, and soldiers from the Army's 7th Infantry Division paddled quietly toward 4 small islands at the southern end of the Kwajalein atoll, pieces of coral barely larger than a city block, lightly held by support troops who had never expected to fight a ground battle. By nightfall, the islands belonged to the United States, and the 145th Field Artillery Battalion had its howitzers dug in and registered before midnight, gun crews working by flashlight to bring Kwajalein Island itself within range. 45 miles to the north, Marines from the 25th Regiment had done the same on 5 more islets, and by morning, Roy and Namur were sitting inside a circle of American artillery that had not existed 24 hours earlier. On the morning of February 1st, everything that had been building for 3 days came down at once. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, land-based artillery firing from the captured islets, carrier aircraft overhead. On Kwajalein Island in the south, 7,000 naval shells fell in a single day, and the artillery on the captured islets added 29,000 more, 36,000 shells in total landing on an island 2.5 miles long and less than half a mile wide. The Japanese had built their strongest defenses facing the open ocean, expecting an attack from the direction every previous American landing had come from. They had not built for this. At the northern end of the atoll, Marines went ashore at Roy, from the lagoon side at 11:45 in the morning, the first wave crossing the reef in armored amphibious tractors, then the second wave, then the third, moving over ground that had already been broken open by Connolly's ships, and 3 days of bombardment. The Japanese defenders who came out of the wreckage to meet them were not the same men who had gone into their bunkers 3 days earlier. Some of them still fought, and fought hard, but they came out dazed, disoriented, blinking into smoke and daylight like men who had spent a week buried alive. The Marines crossed the airfield. By 6 o'clock that evening, 7 hours after the first wave hit the beach, Roy was declared secure. At Tarawa, taking Betio had cost 76 hours. Taking Roy cost 7. But the story of February 1st is not only about what the bombardment accomplished. It is also about one young man who was never supposed to be at the front of that battle at all. Private First Class Richard Beatty Anderson had been born in Tacoma, Washington, and raised in Agnew, a small community on the Olympic Peninsula, the kind of place where a boy's name was known before he could walk. He graduated from Sequim High School, and 7 months after Pearl Harbor, in July of 1942, he walked into a recruiting office in Oakland, California, and enlisted in the Marine Corps. He carried a tattoo on his arm, 4 words, "Death before dishonor." He joined Company E, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines, 4th Marine Division, and he shipped out for the Central Pacific as a mortarman, trained to work behind the rifle companies, providing indirect fire support from a position well back of the front line. On the afternoon of February 1st, for reasons no one who survived that day was ever able to fully explain, Anderson was not with his mortar crew. He was up with the rifle companies instead, moving across the shattered airfield on Roy, carrying a box of grenades. The airfield had been cratered by 3 days of naval gunfire, holes deep enough for a man to disappear into completely. And in the middle of that afternoon, Anderson dropped into one of those craters for cover. 3 other Marines were already inside it. He reached into his box, pulled out a grenade, pulled the pin, and stepped up to throw it. It slipped from his hand. It happens in a fraction of a second. The kind of thing that happens to hands that are exhausted or shaking or slick with sweat in the middle of a battle on a burning island in the middle of the Pacific. The grenade fell to the bottom of the crater. 4 men were down there with it, and there was no time to retrieve it, and no time to climb out, and no time for anything except the one decision Richard Anderson made in whatever fraction of a second remained to him. He threw himself on top of it. He took the full force of the explosion. He was pulled out of the crater and carried back to the beach, evacuated to the transport ship USS Callaway, anchored in the lagoon, and he died that same day, February 1st, 1944. He was 22 years old. He was buried at sea, with full military honors in the waters off Roy Namur. The 3 men who had been in that crater with him walked off the island alive. On August 17, 1944, 6 months and 16 days after his death, a ceremony was held at the naval station on Pier 91 in Seattle. His mother, Mrs. Oscar Anderson, stood at the front and accepted the Medal of Honor on her son's behalf. The citation described conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, and it said that Private First Class Anderson had fearlessly chosen to sacrifice himself to save his companions by hurling his body upon the grenade, taking the full impact of the explosion, and that he had gallantly given his life for his country. 11 months later, on July 7, 1945, Mrs. Anderson stood on a different waterfront in Seattle and christened a destroyer built to carry her son's name, the USS Richard B. Anderson. That ship would serve for 30 years, through Korea and Vietnam and the long tension of the Cold War, carrying the name of a mortarman from a small town on the Olympic Peninsula into waters he never lived to see. Anderson never met Chester Nimitz. He never knew that 2 months earlier an admiral had sat in a conference room and overruled 3 of the finest commanders in the Pacific because he had decided he was not willing to waste a single life he had the power to save. He never knew that Richard Connolly had ordered his own battleships to within 1,500 yards of the beach, so that the bunkers waiting for him would already be broken before he ever set foot on that airfield. But 3 different men, at 3 different ranks, on the same afternoon, had each made the same refusal in their own way. A refusal to let the people beside them pay a price they still had something left to give against. Farther south, the fight for Kwajalein Island itself took longer. The 7th Infantry Division fought for 4 days, bunker by bunker, and the Japanese garrison there did not surrender. They fought until they were killed. The island was declared secure on February 4th. When the final numbers were counted across the entire atoll, Kwajalein Island in the south, Roy Namur in the north, and more than 30 smaller islets taken in between, they told a story that the planners themselves had not expected to be able to tell. More than 8,000 Japanese dead, a few hundred prisoners, most of them Korean laborers who had been brought to the islands against their will and had no particular loyalty to defend. American dead, 372, across an operation that had involved 85,000 troops and more than 300 warships against a garrison of roughly 8,000 Japanese defenders. Set those numbers beside Tarawa, Betio, an island 2 miles long and less than half a mile wide, defended by fewer than 5,000 Japanese troops, had cost more than 1,000 American lives. Kwajalein, a target more than twice the size and defended by a larger garrison, cost less than a third as many American lives. Every planner who had studied the density of Japanese fortifications on Kwajalein had expected the operation to take longer and cost more than Tarawa had. They were wrong, in the one direction that mattered. Nimitz had planned for the fighting to stretch into the middle of February. Kwajalein Island fell on the 4th. Nimitz had fallen on the 2nd. He was weeks ahead of his own schedule, and when prisoner interrogations began coming back describing a lighter, less developed Japanese garrison at Eniwetok, the next atoll 400 miles to the northwest, Nimitz did not call another meeting and did not form another committee. He picked up the telephone and called Raymond Spruance, the same officer who 2 months earlier had told him to his face that the whole plan was too dangerous, and told him to take Eniwetok immediately, 3 months ahead of the date on the original schedule. Spruance did not argue. He did not say that Nimitz had been right and he had been wrong. He did not have to. He simply carried out the order, and Eniwetok fell by February 21st. When the war finally ended, when the last signatures were placed on the surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, the name Kwajalein did not appear prominently in any of the headlines. Tarawa was famous. Iwo Jima was famous. Peleliu and Guadalcanal and Okinawa, battles that had cost thousands of American lives, became part of the nation's memory. Kwajalein did not, and in a strange way, that absence tells you almost everything you need to know about how history chooses what to remember. It is drawn to the places where the most was lost, where the casualty lists ran longest, where the grief back home was heaviest. Kwajalein was won too cleanly, too quickly, and too far ahead of anyone's expectations to make that kind of history. It is the battle that history forgot, precisely because it went right. But the 372 men who did not come home from it were never an abstraction to the families waiting for them. They were sons and husbands and fathers, boys from Tacoma and Georgia and Ohio who had grown up in the years of the Depression and had answered a question none of them had wanted to be asked, on an atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that most Americans still could not find on a map. And the decision that saved so many of the men beside them did not begin with a strategy session or a stack of photographs. It began on a beach called Betio, with a grieving letter, and an admiral who could not look away from what his choices cost other people, and who decided that the safest, most reasonable course of action was no longer one he was willing to take.